All right, it's just turned 10. Still people coming through the lobby, but welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. Sending a warm welcome to everyone here with us. This session will discuss how data can be used for good or manipulated to mislead, why deficit-based reporting harms communities and how to flip the script, the role of researchers, analysts, and journalists in telling the truth, and decolonising data, specifically Indigenous data sovereignty, strength-based storytelling, and ethical analysis. I'm Nadia, the Research and Data Officer, and I work in the Research and Policy team at QCOS, the Queensland Council of Social Service. QCOS is the peak body for community services in Queensland, and our vision is to achieve equality, opportunity, and well-being for every person in every community across Queensland. QCOS acknowledges the historical injustice of colonisation and dispossession on First Nations people and its ongoing impact and legacies. We are committed to reconciliation, self-determination, and opportunity for First Nations peoples as integral steps in achieving equality, opportunity, and well-being for all Queenslanders. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the oldest continuing culture, diverse languages, and knowledge holders in human history. I am joining you from Meanjin, Brisbane, and I respectfully acknowledge the Yagara and Turrbal people and all First Nations colleagues and friends online in the webinar today. For those online in the meeting, please feel free to join us in acknowledging country where you are today through the chat function. So the agenda for today's session will be the presentation on data truth-telling, followed by a Q&A and then a poll, and then moving on to the research and evaluation network details and wrapping up with some upcoming events. A couple of things to note. By default, you will be on mute, but your camera will be turned on. The session will be recorded. If during this session you'd like to ask a question, you can write the question in the chat function. If we run out of time, we can follow up with you individually after the session. Just pop all questions or comments in the chat pane. As the world of AI is ever evolving, there is an increasing potential presence of AI bots like Read AI in our webinars. The presence of these bots can potentially lead to privacy concerns by harvesting information and distributing session content. We will stay vigilant by removing these bots from our meetings, but ask if you see either an AI bot or shared material to please let us know. I would now like to welcome our guest speaker for today's event, Adam Heterick. Adam reached out to QCOS by completing our end-of-year survey last year and has kindly offered to share his knowledge, expertise, and wisdom with our research and evaluation network today. Adam is a proud Wiradjuri man, bioinformatician, data analyst, researcher, evaluator, and Indigenous data sovereignty expert. He is a Bioinformatics Officer working in Indigenous genomics at Black Ochre Data Labs, situated at the Kids Research Institute and with the National Centre for Indigenous Genomics at Australian National University. We are very grateful to have Adam talk to us today about the responsibility of data storytelling and data truth-telling. Thank you, Adam. I will hold it over to you now.
Thanks, Nadia. I will just share my screen now. G'day, everyone. There we go. All right, so I just want to begin by saying that I'm joining you all from Yugambeh country down here on the Gold Coast, and I'd just like to acknowledge their continuing connection to the lands and the waters around me. Yeah, echoing the start there. Just I would like you all to remember that wherever you are, you're on unceded Aboriginal land in this wide, brown, somewhat unpleasant land sometimes. And yeah, feel free to let everyone know the land you're watching in from the chat. I just feel like when we use that language, our old people are watching and listening. And I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present, particularly those that have sort of guided me on this journey. And I guess, yeah, so today we're talking, because data isn't just numbers, it's a powerful storytelling tool. But like like all tools, it can be used responsibly or irresponsibly. So today we'll explore how we can tell strong, ethical, and truthful stories with data. We'll cover how misinformation spreads, how deficit-based data harms Indigenous communities, and how we can change the way that data is used for good. So before I tell you a little bit about me, though, we'll expand more on what Nadia just said. I'm just going to pop this question up for you all to think about, and it's why are stories important? What about stories is the thing that gets our brains ticking over. You don't have to answer, but feel free to throw it in the chat as well. So we'll start with a little bit of his story. Um, my mum's not here to tell her story anymore. So this is a picture of her when she was quite young. But it does make me think a lot about the stories we leave behind, because stories shape how people remember us. So my mum isn't around to talk about growing up in the 50s, living on the cattle station, living in the red dirt, literally being raised in a tent. She always used to say to us boys when we'd leave a door open, I know you weren't born in a tent, but I was. So, she used to love stuff like that. But I mean, who gets to tell the story of people after they're gone? Well, stories aren't just personal. They're in everything, including data. Every data set, every graph, every news article based on numbers, it's all a story and it's all storytelling. So if data tells a story, who gets to decide which story is told? Well, all of us, and me in particular as well. So my mum's gone, but I'm still here. And so I'm a Wiradjuri man from central New South Wales, born in a little town called Warren, so just out past Dubbo there. Um, so I'm a bioinformatician, as we said. So I work with Professor Alex Brown at the Kids Research Institute at Black Ochre Data Labs, and he's also the director of the National Centre for Indigenous Genomics. So there'll be some plugs later for our genomics course that you can. There'll be links shared in the chat, so you can all jump on and get amongst that as well. So I guess previously I also worked at Quake, so I don't know if anyone from Quake is in the chat yet, is watching yet, but shout out to all my former colleagues there. So I work with data every day. Bioinformatics is all about data. And I've seen firsthand how the numbers can be framed in different ways to tell completely different stories. Sometimes it's an accident, but sometimes it's done on purpose. So um, data tells a story, but is the story that's being told the truth? Um, Most people don't really have the time or the expertise to fact check everything that they read. Like, the amount of data and information that's flying at us every day, it's really hard to stay up on it. It's hard to read journal articles. It's hard to read all the news articles. And then if you have to go further to that and read, well, what was this based on? Where did they find their information? It's hard, and it means that people rely on us, so researchers, data analysts, journalists, it relies on us to be honest with data. And what happens when we aren't? How do we know if things are really true? Well, if you're the one reporting it, obviously the onus is on you to use your research skills to find out if what you're reporting is true. And like the old saying, if you're a news reporter and someone says it's raining, your job is to stick your head out the window and find out if it actually is or not. But if you're unscrupulous, you can take advantage of the fact that the person in the street scarcely understands what data is, let alone statistics. And by being deceitful, devious, and dishonest, you can really take advantage of that, and you can trick people basically. So there's an old saying: there are three kinds of lies: lies, damn lies, and statistics. Um, and so most people don't have strong statistical literacy, as I just said. And so this creates gaps where misinformation can thrive.
Mr. Simpson, how do you respond to the charge that petty vandalism, such as graffiti, is down 80%, while heavy sack beatings are up a shocking 900%?
Oh, people can come up with statistics to prove anything, Kent. 40% of all people know that.
So that's a pretty good sort of succinct way of saying that, yeah, statistics you can just make up anything on the spot, and most people probably won't check it. So if I told you that crime had doubled in a town, it sounds bad. But if I told you it went from 10 incidents of assault last year to 20 minor thefts, it's probably not as bad as it actually sounds. It's still more crime, but it's a different type of crime, and it's not as bad. And it's not as dramatic because of the way it's framed can make it sound far worse than it is. And so, yeah, we'll get back to that way of framing. So there's three parts of framing. So there's what is, so that's a situation, some results, a story. It's basically what happened, and then what I tell you about it. So me reporting that to you with my biases, and my spin on it, me trying to tell you the way I want you to hear it, and then what you hear yourself. So your biases come into play. You only hear what's interesting to you, or maybe you mishear and you think the opposite of what I said. These things shape our perception, and so that framing is super important. You probably don't have a lot of control about what people take from your story, but you can still try and frame it so that it is true, and so at least what's written down is what actually happened. so so because our biases influence what we believe, we have to find ways to establish what the ground truth is. And that's super hard. As I said before, there's so much information flying around, that it's almost impossible. Like if someone does something and then I tell you about it, by the time you hear it, it's already secondhand information. So the old game of telephone where you start with one message, and by the third or fourth person it's a completely different message. That's the same with what we report, and the way we work with data. It can change quite a lot in the reproduction and the retelling of stories. And yeah, it's just harder and harder to see where information comes from, and whether whether your original source is true. And social media makes this even worse because you can reshare a story and people can think it's new, and then you realize that it's actually a story from 2019. It's just been reshared so often. It's really tricky nowadays to find out where information comes from and whether it's true or not. So the noise of misinformation is what we're getting to. So research has shown, recent studies shown that people misinterpret headlines about a third of the time. So whether that's that they read a true headline and believe it is false, or they believe a false headline, one third of the time. So um, that's a lot. That's a lot. And then if you add to the fact that the media always has to fill space, whether there's something important to report or not. So there's always enough news for a half-hour news slot. There's always enough news to fill exactly every page of the newspaper. And that's just noise. A lot of it is just noise. Some of it's advertising disguised as a news article. Um, like this, for example, there's a headline saying it's a slow news day just to fill the extra part of the paper. And maybe in smaller towns, it gets like that. Like they report on anything just to make sure that the paper's full. Um, so when there's so much drive to fill space, that means bad actors can exploit gaps in our knowledge, and they can push information that way. So they create stories that are great facsimiles of news, but they're not actually news. They're kind of like this. This is a this is a clickbait news headline in real form. So it's the old IKEA hot dog, right? It looks good. When you walk into IKEA, you see that thing, and you're like, "Wow, I got to have me one of them." That's really gonna help me after walking around this maze. That's gonna make my trip, worth it. And but it looks like the real thing, and it satisfies that emotional need. But when you get it, it's garbage. You still eat it, you still eat it up, but I do all the time. I love those things. But basically, a lot of these clickbait news titles are essentially an IKEA hot dog in news form. So, you know, how are we supposed to fight information when it spreads so easy, when people are so attracted to it, when it just fulfills things that people like? It hits their biases. It makes them feel like they're justified in the world. How do we fight it? It's hard. So, in today's world, misinformation, as I've said, multiple times already, it spreads faster than ever. Whether it's intentional or it's accidental, misleading data can shape public opinion, influence policies, and reinforce harmful stereotypes. We see this particularly in how statistics are used and sometimes misused to support certain narratives. So we'll break down a few of the key ways that this happens. Firstly, misusing statistics as disinformation. So incorrect calculations or flawed methodologies can lead to outright false accusations. So an example of this is the warrior gene myth, where a poorly contextualized study suggested that Indigenous people from Aotearoa were genetically predisposed to violence. It was misinterpreted when it was first announced, misinterpreted when it was read, and when it was reported. The author of the study even stated that the news media had misinterpreted this study, but the narrative persisted, and it was used to justify racist policies, racist policing. So many things came off the back of that, and it was a classic a case of science, maybe poor science, being weaponized, and it reinforced stereotypes because people trust numbers. Even a poorly explained statistic can still cause harm long after it's disproven. There's the old saying that a lie can run around the world before the truth has even got its boots on. Another way is using real numbers to misinform. So presenting true statistics in a misleading way to shape perceptions. And a common example of this is crime stats. I made an example about that earlier, but fairly commonly in the US and Australia, probably other countries as well, the media will often report crime rates by race, but they'll not adjust for factors like socioeconomic status, policing bias, court sentencing bias. A headline might say, Indigenous people are X times more likely to be arrested. But they'll ignore the systemic issues that sort of come with that. So over-policing in Indigenous communities, a higher likelihood of being charged for minor offences, court and sentencing disparities. All of those things shape that headline and shape the situation, but they're never explained. It's always just the raw number that is shown. And because the numbers are real, and the framing method misleads the public, they think that the cause is inherent to the group of people rather than structural, rather than the system set up around the people. So misleading crime stats have been used to justify over-policing, harsh sentencing, and put into place racist policies, basically. If you only ever look at a number without the full picture, you really can tell a story, whatever story you want, whether it's true or not. And then we get on to some of my favorite bad sort of images. So these are sort of Fox News style graphs where they just distort the graph to tell whatever story they want. So economic data is common for this. So they manipulate, they change the axis, they miss context, or they change the way numbers work to push their political narrative. And sometimes it looks like it takes them far more work to doctor a graph than it does to actually just make a bad graph, like with bad numbers in it. So this is an example. So how do you hide a drop in unemployment rate when a new president comes in? You just plot it higher on the graph. So over here we've got 8.6, which is about the same level as a 9% unemployment, and it's higher than 8.8%. So people just look at this at first glance. They see the line. They don't really look at the numbers. They go, oh, okay. President Obama's doing a terrible job with unemployment, and of course that's the narrative Fox wanted to push at this time. We've got another one. These pie graphs don't add up to 100, and the averages don't even work out. So I don't know how they even make these pie graphs and look at them and go, that's correct, because it's crazy. It's like, that is not how a pie graph works. And if I had a pie that had more than 100% in it, I'd really like it because I like pie. And then a final one. So this is during COVID times. So looking at this, we'll see that the dates along the bottom aren't uniform. They're just random numbers picked out at a certain time. And even the numbers along the side of the graph, they don't rise uniformly. They rise at whatever number they want. It's not even logarithmic. So there's no method to this. And it just helps them show, and I bet if you plotted this, it would still show a rise if you plotted it correctly. But they want to show a sharp, stark rise like that. So people just don't check the numbers. And the purpose of graphs is to make information clearer, but these just muddy the waters. So many people don't even check sources, or they don't really care about the accuracy if a story fits their existing beliefs. It's fairly sad that that's the case, but that's confirmation bias in sort of practice. They see it, they believe it, it checks out to them according to their own internal biases, so they would never think to look any further. So why do people fall for it? Yeah, it's emotional appeal. There's a lack of data literacy, as I said. Most people aren't trained to critically analyze statistics or visualizations. So, I mean, truthful data storytelling is a really tough gig. So, how do we fight it? I mean, we can teach data literacy. We can help people recognize misleading statistics, charts, and claims. We can probably add more clarity into what we write. That makes it tricky though, because then it's longer to read and people switch off. So, I think there was a publisher that said to, I think it was Carl Sagan. When he was writing novels back in time, that, you know, every graph and every equation that he added would reduce his readership by 50%. You know, people switch off when you start to explain things like that. We can encourage people to verify information before accepting it as truth. Again, that's increasingly hard. We can call out bad data practices. The onus is on all of us to do this. Publicly debunked and correct misinformation when it appears. Again, with social media, that makes it harder, and it often opens you up to, you know, online abuse. So it's a fine line to walk. But misinformation thrives in this confusion, and it thrives in that sort of ecosystem. But our job is just to cut through the noise and tell the real story. So, turning things around. Too often, Indigenous data is framed in ways that reinforce negative stereotypes. So all what I just said, that is used with Indigenous data very, very often. The statistics might be accurate, but the way they're presented creates a misleading and damaging picture of Indigenous communities. So this is where distinguished professor and Palawa sociologist Maggie Walter describes as bad data. So these 5 factors that she highlighted, they describe how data is often weaponized against Indigenous people all around the world. So bad data stands for blaming data. So it's data that's used to blame Indigenous people for their own circumstances rather than acknowledging any structural or historical factors. So high incarceration rates are often framed as Indigenous people being inherently criminal, instead of looking at systemic racism in policing and courts. Then there's aggregate data. So this is where data is lumped together, and it masks sort of important differences within Indigenous communities. By grouping it all together, they sort of mask it as we're protecting people's privacy. But if you use national statistics instead of looking at regional variation, we can erase success stories, or we can sort of hide unique local challenges, which are important to communities, but they never know about it and they don't have the data to track it. And then there's decontextualized data, so numbers presented without historical or social context, basically, making issues, they seem like personal or cultural failings, again, rather than systemic or structural issues. So an example of this is reporting school attendance without mentioning the impact of racism, schools, historical forced removals, cultural responsibilities, family responsibilities. If you don't talk about that, it just makes it like Indigenous kids don't go to school. There's an issue we need to fix. And we don't want that. We never want that. Then there's deficit and government priority data. Data is being framed to highlight deficits rather than the strengths. And this is very commonly used to justify government intervention and poor policy. So it's because governments collect and present data in ways that serve their interests. They reinforce negative narratives. So a report might emphasise gaps in Indigenous employment, but they don't acknowledge any systemic barriers, and they definitely wouldn't acknowledge any successful community-led economic initiatives because they want to tell a particular story. So they're going to ignore positives, and because they own the data, they can say whatever they like about it. Then restricted access, moving on from governments owning data. So Indigenous communities don't have control over how their data is collected, definitely not how it's stored, and definitely not how it's used. Because governments and institutions hold on to the data, it really makes self-determined research and decision-making almost impossible. Health data, for example, on Indigenous populations is collected, but it's not shared back. And that means that the communities, they don't have an ability to advocate for better services on their own behalf. And any of that data locked away, it's increasingly harder and harder to get hold of as well, despite the government's claims that closing the gap priorities are working. And there's a link, and I'm pretty sure Amy just shared in the chat the actual document as well, if you want to have a read through that. So further to that, Professor Walter also describes the 5 Ds of deficit reporting. So disparity. So this is where Indigenous data is used to show gaps between non-Indigenous and Indigenous people. So to close the gap, Indigenous people die 8 years earlier than other Australians. And this cold comparison leaves out the structural causes. It leaves out racism in healthcare, care, lack of access to service, and the historical injustices that have shaped the outcomes and got to where we are today. Then there's data of deprivation. So where Indigenous communities are frequently depicted as lacking resources or education or wealth. An example is when they say Indigenous children grow up in overcrowded housing, but they don't speak of, the forced removals, the stolen wages, land dispossession. They never speak about that. They report the bad and don't talk about any of the strengths. Disadvantage. So Indigenous people are portrayed as falling behind other Australians. So Indigenous employment rates remain lower than non-Indigenous Australians. So what's missing here, again, is there's rarely reference to the systemic barriers. We're seeing a theme. They don't talk about workplace discrimination, a lack of culturally safe jobs. They don't talk about geographic disadvantage. And finally, not finally, there's two more. There's data of dysfunction. So that's where Indigenous communities are framed as broken or chaotic or violent. And it reinforces those harmful stereotypes again. So media coverage focuses on crime statistics without context, as I said before. And they don't talk about the impacts of colonisation, intergenerational trauma, and they definitely wouldn't talk about the resilience of Indigenous communities or any positive programs that come out of community. Then there's data of difference. So it's where Indigenous ways of life, our ways of knowing, being and doing, are treated as problems rather than valid cultural responses and differences. Again, it's about Indigenous. A common example is Indigenous students not meeting national education benchmarks. And it's because the education system itself is colonial and Eurocentric, and it doesn't incorporate Indigenous ways of knowing, being or doing. And so, there's that old saying that, a fish is going to think it's an idiot if you rate it on its ability to climb a tree. Like, why are we using a model that is designed for a different time and a different world to measure everyone? It's not one size fits all. That's also why my children are homeschooled. There you go. So, how do we turn things around? So, numbers don't lie, but as I've just shown, the way they're framed can mislead people. And so our job, as I've said before, is to tell the full truth and not just a version that fits a deficit-based narrative. So, I've given you examples of how the deficit gets reported, and the constant comparison is the difficult part. Like, if one population does differ from the majority, how do you report it without describing a deficit? How do you report it safely without having to talk about deficits? Do we even need to compare populations to each other? I'm not sure. It's probably not valid. And I'm not here with all the answers. I'm just talking. So, but this is where you as a storyteller could have an impact, especially if you fall victim to your own biases. So, maybe you want to show that a program of work has been successful, and it's because you're trying to attract more funding. So you twist some numbers around, you report things a little bit differently, or maybe you want to show things that are worse than they truly are. These two situations are perfect examples of what we call political election ads. Joking aside, your biases, those of your organization, they can all change the narrative that you should reporting. And it's a lot of responsibility on your shoulders. So much. People think that it's really easy too. They just say it's tell the truth, show differences without judging people, make sure people don't misunderstand, make sure that you keep people's attention. That's super easy. So easy to write something that does all of those things, right? Probably not. All right, so now on to decolonising data. So most data systems were designed by and for governments, definitely not for Indigenous people. Data is often used to control rather than empower. So governments collect data and they analyse data about us, but they rarely do it with us, and often it's not even for us. So many official statistics frame Indigenous communities in a deficit-based way, as I just showed, and it emphasises those disparities and doesn't include the context. So how do we move towards ethical and strength-based data practice? So we've just got a few sort of suggestions and a few ideas here. So the first one is we can sort of mandate and advocate for race and ethnicity collection in health data. Amazingly, recent studies have shown that nearly 40% of clinical registries don't actually even collect Indigenous identity. And when they do collect this information, most don't even report it or allow access to it. And it leads to data invisibility. Like, I understand about privacy, but when Aboriginal researchers are reaching out to get access to this data because community has asked for it, how they can still say no is a little bit beyond me. So, and then further to that, many people, when they go to one of these facilities, a health service, a social service, maybe they don't even report that they are Indigenous, and they do it due to fear of racism, a loss of their privacy, because Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders don't really apply to them. They're just government terms at the end of the day anyway. An example is that ambulance services across the nation, they don't collect ethnicity, and so data gaps exist. I mean, ambulances are probably more concerned with saving your life rather than asking, what you identify as. But because they don't collect that information, we're missing sort of really important information about emergency care access. Unless people go to hospital, we won't see the journey of those people. We miss all the people that the ambulance has arrived and provided attention to, and then they just disappear. If those people don't then re-enter the health system, we miss that data, and we miss the stories that come from that data. So without data, inequalities remain hidden and unaddressed. The next thing is we can, collect sort of nation level affiliation. We can collect people's mob and not just their broad Indigenous identity. And as I said before, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander are government categories. They're not really community identities at all. And they erase diversity. And different nations around the country have different health and social outcomes. Grouping them together masks those differences. It sort of helps portray any negatives and it masks all the positives. Some remote communities have higher incidences of chronic disease, others don't. Without detailed data, policies remain ineffective because a one-size-all-fit policy doesn't work for everyone. And sometimes it means that the communities that need the most help get the same level of help as everyone, and that's inequity. So the next thing we could do to help strength-based data is we can work with Indigenous communities to sort of oversample their populations in research. We do it in a culturally safe and community-led manner, but the problem with small sample sizes, it means that Indigenous people are often left out of national statistics because they say that it's a lack of privacy. They say there's not enough power in the data. And it leads to reports that say the data is unavailable or the numbers are too small to analyse. But the problem with this is if we're not counted, we don't count for policy decisions. And policy decisions can be made up that apply to the majority and not us. And then we can work to develop better statistical methodologies for small populations that provide power while also retaining privacy. Government agencies do refuse to release Indigenous data, as I said before, and it's due to privacy concerns. They say that the small numbers could make individuals identifiable, which I see, but they then extend this to large data sets, and they cite the same privacy concerns even when data sets are at a national level. There's no sort of geographical location tied to it. They say we still can't release it for privacy. And I'm speaking from experience there. That's happened to me more than once. So while privacy matters, it is used as an excuse to withhold critical data from communities. Close the Gap Priority Reform 4 is all about increasing data access for Aboriginal people, but it seems like it's only used when it suits the government and not when we ask. There are solutions that exist. There are statistical methods that have been created to protect identity while still reporting useful data. And with the advent of large language models, like models can be developed that help to create power in data sets while also retaining privacy and retaining sovereignty of data. Probably not ChatGPT or DeepSeek, but we can create local models at the very least. And then finally, we can sort of ensure communities control and access their data. We can develop policies, but then actually implement them as well. You know, many Indigenous communities don't own the data that's collected about them. It's held by governments, it's held by researchers, it's held by institutions. Data sovereignty is essential. Communities should decide how the data is used, stored, and collected. There are ways to store data on country that still provide, safe and secure access for researchers, but ensure that Indigenous people retain control of it. It's just about, finding investment and finding political will to get this done. Our friends across the ditch, the Maori Data Sovereignty Movement, they've led to various Indigenous controlled research projects in Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's happened over in Canada as well. And it's happened in Australia in certain pockets, but we need it to happen more widespread, and there needs to be really sort of real national policy to get this done. And it's about empowering data owners, basically, because so far we've talked about how data can be used to tell misleading and deficit-based or even outright false stories. But what happens when communities do take back control of their data? It's about shifting power. So for too long, as I've said before, and I harp on about it with everyone I talk to, Indigenous data has been collected, controlled, and analysed by outsiders. It's people who think they don't share our lived experiences, they don't understand our stories, and they don't even ask us what we think about it. The core problem is that data is gathered about us, but decisions on how to use it are made without us. Researchers will parachute in, they'll extract knowledge, and they'll publish their findings, and they move on. That's the way it's been. And then community doesn't even get access to the data afterwards. So, what does data ownership really mean? It means that First Nations people, they decide what data is collected, how it's analysed, who gets to use the data, and how the story is told. And the role of professionals, data professionals, researchers, journalists we need to shift from being storytellers, and we need to be amplifiers for these stories. Our job isn't to impose those narratives, it's to help communities shape their own narratives. So, there are strength-based Indigenous data sovereignty collectives all around the world now. So there's Maamnari Wingara here in Australia. There's the US Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network. There's the First Nations Information Governance Centre in Canada. Movements like these are starting to reshape the conversation. They're starting to put data back in the hands of the people it represents. And then it means that, if a community wants to highlight any challenges that they're facing, we can support them to do that, and we can help them tell their story. And if they want to showcase their strengths, we can amplify that too. We can spread the word. We can say, look at what these folks are doing. And by sharing these stories and sharing this knowledge, that's when we start to see a real uplift for everyone. So now we'll talk a little bit about the future of Indigenous data methodologies. So an ideal approach. So if we truly want to decolonize data, I don't know why that one's sitting in the middle of the page. Ignore that. If we truly want to decolonize data, we have to change not just how data is collected, but also who controls it, how it's framed, and what methodologies we use. So what can an ethical, strength-based approach to Indigenous data look like? Firstly, before we can do anything, we need to acknowledge the harm that's been done by past data practices. Let's be real. Historically, data was used as a tool of colonial control. Census records were used to justify racist policies. Crime stats have been used to frame Indigenous people as threats and problems. Medical data has been used to stereotype rather than heal. We need to acknowledge the history before we can rebuild trust, before we can work towards healing. It's impossible to move forward unless we get everyone who is in control of data. It's a big ask, but until we can start getting people to acknowledge that, yep, in the past it was bad, well, let's try and fix it. We can't fix it at all. Then we need to, make sure that we're measuring and valuing those protective community and cultural factors. I mean, because Indigenous communities aren't just surviving. In many cases, they are thriving in ways that Western data doesn't capture. Instead of measuring deficits, we can work towards measuring community strengths. Like we can work out a way to measure cultural wealth, how our connection to country, language, and culture strengthens our well-being. We can report about that instead of just saying there's another deficit, there's another problem. We have to ensure that there is Indigenous governance at every stage. It's not enough just to consult Indigenous communities. It's not enough to make decisions first and then ask how we feel about them. We have to be in the room. We have to organise the rooms ourselves and invite other people in. We need full leadership and decision making power because data should be owned by First Nations people. That means having control over the collection, the analysis, the reporting, and then later other people can help share it. Again, disaggregating data properly and safely, because we need to break down data by mob, by nation, by community, not just lump everyone together under Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander. Like a Wiradjuri person's experience isn't the same as a Yolnus person's. We need data that reflects these differences nationally. Again, the privacy concerns I agree with, but if community are in control of their own data, the privacy is less problematic. Because it's not one institution holding all of that private sort of community level data, it's communities holding their own data and then deciding how it gets used. And then, we need to address disparities in STEM education, even STEAM education, if you add art in there as well. So, training more First Nations researchers, data analysts, storytellers, like, the future isn't just about changing how non-Indigenous people handle data. It's about making sure that we Indigenous people are leading in the space. We're not just the best, Indigenous person working with data. We are the best people working with data, period. And that means more funding for Indigenous STEM education, more Indigenous-led research centres, more support for mob who want to work in research, data and policy. Whether you came at it sideways like me or whether it's something you've wanted to do when you were, a little fella, like we need to support people. We need to find them and we need to support them so they grow in the space. Overall, if we can get the powers to be to recognise that community knowledge that is important and then invest in Indigenous data capacity, we're going to be well on the way. The battle is getting the recognition and the investment, but I think they're the two sort of low hanging fruit that we can do, and then everything else will flow from it. So I've spoken for a while now. So look, I don't have all the answers. I have lots of thoughts and I have lots of opinions. But I guess more important than what I say, I want to hear from everyone. Like down the track, I'd love to talk to everyone. Where if you see me, just stop me for a yarn, because I'd like there to be a strong network for us all to lean on when we're working through these important jobs. Whether it's you flick off an email to get someone to review what you've written, you have a yarn over Teams or whatever, because like telling a story about data and making that story about strength is hard, especially when all that's been done before is to report differences, negatives, problems. But data storytelling doesn't have to be about those deficits. It can be about strength. It can be about truth. It can be about self-determination, because community should shape how their own stories are told. Our role is to make sure those stories are accurate, ethical, empowering. We can challenge those deficit-based data narratives. The onus is on it to do that. We can demand accountability in research and media, and we can definitely support Indigenous-led data sovereignty initiatives. We can educate others, because as I've said, misinformation thrives when people don't understand the numbers. That's as simple as it is. It's easy to tell a lie when people aren't going to check your numbers. Like if we teach the public, we can challenge those biases, and if we change just a few minds, the deficit narrative starts to lose its power. I mean, maybe I'm just an idealist. I'm probably too hopeful, but they always say that hope is the first step on the road to disappointment. But I'm not trying to be cynical anymore. I get older, and I'm trying to still be skeptical, but not cynical. I don't want this newspaper headline to be about me in the future. So we need to do better. We need to tell, we need to let the data speak the truth. And we have to listen to the voices behind the numbers, because data holds our memories, but only our stories hold meaning. So let's honour both and speak truth with care. So that's it. Mandangu, that means thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Adam, and sharing such valuable insights. We have a couple questions from the chat. Anyone else with questions, please just pop them on the chat and we can get some answers. So, Adam, can you provide an example of data which places receive but don't share? This was in relation to that the hospital data, your example about ambulance. Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess, and it's sort of not burying the lead. I'm working on a project at ANU, which is about adverse drug reactions and pharmacogenomics. So I've been trying to find data on adverse drug reactions amongst mob, and their data exists at the TGA, and they collect Indigenous identity as part of that data set, but they refuse to publish it. They refuse to work with it or report upon it. And they cite privacy in personal communication to me. They said that they couldn't release it due to privacy concerns. And I said, you don't even have states attached to this data. It's just a national level data set. You can't, it's like you have a list of reactions. You can't breach privacy using a list of reactions. And I said, community has asked for this data. And they said, we're not going to release it to you. So I've had to go a long way around to find access to adverse drug reaction data, and it's taken me a year. I'm this close to getting it. So that's going to be something that I'll be releasing soon, and then we'll start to have maybe some information about how medicines work differently amongst mob, and then the genes that affect that and stuff. So that's an example of an organisation that simply refuses to share data that is collected, because I think it's in their own best interest to not share it, because maybe, just maybe, they don't want to associate with, they don't want to say this particular drug causes a problem in Indigenous people and we've known about it for so long. Maybe that's just me, just sort of, thinking conspiratorially, but yeah, that's an example firsthand. So.
Thank you. Amanda also commented that they love the mob level data. Interested in thinking about how that could be governed. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So I think that might sort of involve, because we're going to be talking about smaller data sets. I would probably be hesitant to put that in the hands of just one organisation, particularly a government organisation. That might be something that we would have to implement sort of at a community level, and then maybe communities collaborate amongst each other. I mean, you could have a federated data system. So, I mean, this is huge, right? So a federated data system where, everyone has access to an individual, like a shared sort of pool, but they have security levels. And so while it's stored on everyone's sort of servers, it's encrypted unless it's the data that you actually own. And then you can obviously request from everyone to collect data and share, with certain privacy principles. But I mean, that's probably, it's, like I said, a lot of this stuff is going to be really hard to do, but we need to start sort of thinking about it now, because unless we can start with more and more data being developed, we run the risk of, if we're not having this data in our own hands and we're not collecting the right data, we'll fall behind in terms of policy and investment in the future. But yeah, I think mob level data would probably be best held in the hands of community, and then they collaborate with other communities to share the stories and sort of report on that. Yeah.
Thank you. Wade says in the justice sector, they've found that community means different things to different local regions, and who should be able to access community information from a justice lens. Do you have any comment on navigating that?
Yeah, so again, that's sort of it's that tricky thing where, I mean, are you going to set up a community organization that represents just the mob from that community? Are you going to set up something that represents all of the people in a certain geographical location? And I mean, that's a hard one, especially from a justice lens, because privacy. I mean, privacy is important across everything. But from a justice lens, I think there's a different sort of feeling there. No, I don't. I don't have any really good ideas about that, unfortunately. Apart from trying to sort of again collaborate between communities, and again that sort of even difference in definition, that needs to be worked through as well. So I mean, and can you find a unifying way to define community for everyone? That's going to take lots of cups of tea with with lots of people to work out how to work that one through. Unfortunately, and I don't have answers for that. I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. We might close off with one last question if there are no more in the chat, and that would be, what is the number one question you would recommend always asking yourself when you first see a statistic or data set?
The number one, well, the thing that I do, the first thing that I do is check where it's come from. So, I mean, you can tell a lot about a data system by how it's been collected and who did it. So always check where it's come from. If you don't have that information at hand, try and find out, because you'll know immediately if people have worked with Indigenous folk to collect an Indigenous data set. You'll know almost immediately if that's been done, because normally the way we advocate to do it is you give credit to the community that you've worked with, and have them involved on the project. So if you can see that some Indigenous people have identified themselves through that process, that there's at least some sort of cultural sort of lens that's been applied over it. But yeah, always check where it's come from. Check, like even news articles, check where they're getting their data from. It means that it makes reading a 5-minute article maybe 20 minutes or half an hour. But if you can spare that time, it's so important.
Thank you for that advice. I think that's a very good summary of the presentation and a good first step. Well, there don't seem to be any more questions in the chat. So if we could ask everyone now to participate in a SurveyMonkey poll, we'd love to hear your feedback about the session and how it went. It's a simple 4-question survey. The link is in the chat now, and please feel free to share any qualitative feedback or comments you have through the poll as well. Give a couple of minutes for people to open the link. Lots of thank yous coming from the chat. All right, so to wrap up, a reminder about the Research and Evaluation Network membership. Network meetings and webinars are open to everyone, as they are about sharing resources and collaboration. However, social service staff in research and evaluation roles are particularly encouraged to attend. Our aim is to deliver a community of practice that promotes collaboration and sharing of knowledge in relation to evaluation methodologies and outcome measurements for community services. Our network adopts a strength-based participatory focus that leverages, draws on, and values current knowledge, expertise, and capabilities that exist within the sector. And just a friendly reminder, we also have the Research and Evaluation Forum that sits within the Microsoft Team platform. You'll find the instructions on how to join that in the chat pane. And you can also access the Research and Evaluation Network webinar recordings and resources on the Community Door Research and Evaluation Resource Hub page and YouTube channel. I will share the link in the chat now. And QCOS is hitting the road for our town halls across Queensland, and we'd love for you to join us. We'll be discussing emerging issues in your area, sharing the latest data on your region, and talking about workforce development and how we can support your organisation to attract and retain the team you need. We'll share the town hall details in the chat if you'd like to join us for any of those sessions. The QCOS Community Sector Survey is now live. As a peak body, we use our annual survey results to underpin our strategy and activities and to ensure that the voice of the community sector is accurately captured and reflected. If you work in our sector, please complete the survey. The link is in the chat. And for those of you who might be interested, QCOS also facilitate and coordinate a domestic, family and sexual violence data insights network. The network provides an opportunity for collaboration and knowledge sharing in the area of DFSV data with the aim of more effectively utilising community sector resources and products developed by the Department of Families, Seniors, Disability Services and Child Safety to promote improved outcomes and data capability across DFSV systems, service systems. For more details about the network, you can learn more on our website. The link is in the chat. Thank you again for staying online and engaging with us in today's session. A very big thank you to Adam for your presentation today, and we look forward to connecting again in July. Take care, everybody. Have a good day. Our contact details are on the slide and again in the chat if you'd like to reach out to us to provide feedback or ask any other questions. Thank you.